Hey everyone, if you're listening to this, you're probably pretty interested in education policy, and this deep dive is going to be right up your alley.
Yeah.
We're talking about something pretty huge.
Potentially huge.
President Trump is considering taking executive action to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education.
Whoa.
Yeah,
That's a big one.
I know.
If it even happens.
Right, so we're going to look at two sources for this deep dive. The first one is an excerpt from a document titled Pasted Text. And then we're also going to be looking at an article from CBS News, and that is titled Trump Considering Executive Action to Dismantle Education Department, sources say.
Okay, so you know what's interesting about this is it's not saying that it's happening for sure,
Right.
just that it's being considered,
Right.
which I think makes it all the more interesting because we can kind of play out this what-if scenario.
Right.
And that's what we're going to try and do today. We're going to be looking at what it would mean for federal student loans, for example,
Right.
for programs for disadvantaged students, all sorts of things like that.
The whole landscape could change.
Exactly. And one of the big questions, too, is just, can a president even do this?
Right. What are the limits?
What are the limits to executive action?
Right.
That's a big question.
Yeah, so let's try to understand the motivation here.
All right.
Both of the sources say that Trump wants to shrink the federal bureaucracy.
Makes sense.
And this goes back...
He's made statements to this effect in the past,
Right.
like as far back as 2016.
Yeah, even during his campaign.
Yes.
And then in 2023, he also popped up and made a similar statement.
So this seems like a long-held goal of his.
Right.
You know, may it be rooted in a particular ideology of what the federal government should and shouldn't do.
Right.
And actually, the CBS article mentions that he's not alone in this thinking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, apparently, Elon Musk,
Yeah.
you know, the Tesla guy,
Right.
now the Dogecoin guy.
Wait, Dogecoin.
Apparently he's all for...
I'm trying to picture Elon Musk weighing in on education policy.
I know, right? It's
This looks strange.
a little head scratcher, but yeah, apparently he's all for shrinking the federal workforce as well.
Okay, before we get too sidetracked by DOGE and rockets and everything,
Yeah.
let's back up a little bit.
Right.
What does the Department of Education actually do?
Yeah, that's a good question.
We've got to start there.
Yeah, they wear a lot of hats, you know? I mean, they handle all of the federal financial aid,
Oh.
like Pell Grants, for example.
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
You might have even used them
I did.
back in the day.
Uh,
They also collect data on schools,
okay.
enforce anti-discrimination policies, and run programs for economically disadvantaged and special needs students.
So a lot on the line, potentially.
That's a lot on the line, yeah.
But here's something that I think is important to remember that the CBS article pointed out. The department only provides less than 10% of public school funding.
Right.
The majority comes from
State and local.
state and local taxes.
Right.
So, you know, dismantling the department wouldn't just suddenly mean that public schools are gone,
You know it's not like that.
but it would change things.
It would definitely change things.
For sure.
It's like, you know, right now they're like the national coordinator, you know, like they're kind of setting the ground rules, you know, they're distributing the funds, and, you know, it could all become a lot more fragmented if you were to take that away.
Right. Okay. So potentially a big shakeup, but not a total shutdown.
Right.
Let's get back to how this could even happen, though.
Okay.
Like this whole executive action versus legislation thing. What's the deal with that?
So think of it this way. Executive action is like if the president like makes a company-wide rule,
Okay.
but he can't like change the whole mission statement of the company.
Gotcha.
To get rid of an entire department, like the Department of Education, Congress would have to pass a law.
So even if Trump is super serious about this,
Right.
he can't just snap his fingers and make it happen.
Exactly. It would be a long political battle.
Wow.
And, you know, and that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Like, what might happen if he did succeed?
Yeah. What would happen?
Well, the CBS article threw out a couple of ideas. You know, programs could be moved to other agencies,
Like where?
like the Treasury,
Okay.
the Justice Department,
Uh-huh.
maybe Health and Human Services.
I don't know about that.
I mean...
Can you imagine the Treasury taking on something like that?
Right.
Like they're already...
They're already struggling with IRS backlogs.
Right. Are they really going to be able to manage millions of student loans?
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And you've also got to think about, the political side of things.
Right.
Like student loan forgiveness is such a hot button issue now.
Yeah.
And if you move that responsibility to a different agency, it's like,
Could totally change the game.
yeah, who knows what could happen?
And what about all those programs for disadvantaged students?
Right.
Like things like Title I schools and special education services, like those just seem way too crucial to just disappear.
Absolutely. I mean, those programs are essential for making sure that all students have a fair shot no matter what their background is.
Mm-hmm.
And if the department goes poof,
Right.
their future is a big question mark.
Yeah.
I mean, even moving them to other agencies, like you were saying with the Treasury,
Uh-huh.
or maybe moving special education to Health and Human Services. I
Wow.
mean, that would be so complicated.
Logistically, yeah.
Yeah, talk about a nightmare.
So it sounds like we've got this potential for massive disruption,
Yeah.
but is everyone on board with this?
Definitely not.
No.
The CBS article quotes Senator Mike Rounds,
Good.
who's a Republican from South Dakota,
Okay.
and he is all for getting rid of the department.
Okay, so he's on that side.
He's on that side, yeah.
What about the other side?
Well, on the other side, you have groups like the National Education Association.
Right, the big teachers union.
Yeah, they're fighting tooth and nail to protect the department.
Okay, so we've got a real tug-of-war brewing here.
Yeah, definitely a tug of
That's-
war.
But stepping back for a second,
Okay,
what are the core arguments here?
right.
Like, why would anyone want to just get rid of the Department of Education in the first place?
Well, a lot of it comes down to this age-old debate about the role of the federal government.
Right.
People who want to dismantle it, they often argue that education should really be handled at the state and local level.
Right, closer to home.
Closer to home, less federal interference.
Less bureaucracy.
Less bureaucracy, exactly.
And they also say that a smaller federal bureaucracy just means less waste.
Right.
More efficiency.
More efficiency, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the people who want to keep the department, they probably say that it's vital for making sure that every kid has access to a good quality education no matter where they live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They'd point to things like Title I funding for schools in low-income areas
Right.
as proof that you need the feds involved
Yeah.
to level the playing field.
So it really comes down to this fundamental question, hands off or hands on? What should the federal government's role in education be?
That's the question.
And we're going to keep looking at that question in part 2 of this deep dive.
We are.
But first, we need to understand a little bit more about how the department came to be in the first place.
Okay.
We're going to dig into the history and the context of all of this when we get back.
Mhm.
All right, so we've talked about what could happen if the Department of Education is dismantled. But I think to really understand this, we need some historical context.
I agree with that. Understanding how the department came to be kind of helps us see why this decision is so loaded.
Yeah,
This department is a relatively new creation.
right.
It was established in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter.
That's right. You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah,
It's kind of wild to think that it's actually younger than me.
I know.
So what prompted its creation in the first place?
Well, there were a few factors at play.
Okay.
One was this growing sense that education was really key to national strength.
Oh, interesting.
This was the Cold War era,
Right.
and there were a lot of anxieties about keeping pace with the Soviet Union
Okay.
in areas like science and technology.
So education is like a national security issue.
Yeah, it definitely played a role.
Huh, that's fascinating.
There was also a strong push for greater equity in education.
Okay.
The civil rights movement had just happened,
Right.
and that exposed huge disparities between schools serving white students and those serving minority students. And
Yeah.
so creating a dedicated department was seen as a way to address those inequalities.
That makes sense. Having a central authority could help make sure that federal funding and policies were actually promoting fairness,
Exactly.
across the board.
But you know what? Even back then, this idea wasn't universally embraced.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some people argued that it was federal overreach,
Uh-huh.
that education was a state and local matter.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's like we're having the same argument all over again.
Just a few decades later. Which brings us back to, the potential consequences of Trump's idea.
Right.
We've talked about student loans. We've talked about programs for disadvantaged students.
Yeah.
But what about just the practical side of things?
Right.
Like, how would this massive shift even play out?
Well, it would be incredibly complex.
Yeah.
You're talking about a massive bureaucracy,
Right.
thousands of employees, a whole web of interconnected programs,
Right.
figuring out which functions go where, how to transfer data, who's responsible for what.
Right.
It would be a logistical nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not
Yeah,
kidding.
and there's also, the potential for disruption during that transition.
Right. It just seems like chaos waiting to happen.
There's a real risk there.
Yeah.
Think about all the students who rely on federal financial aid,
Right.
the schools that depend on Title funding, the families who count on special education services.
Hmm.
Any hiccups in the system
Yeah.
could have a huge ripple effect on their lives.
This isn't just about, abstract policies.
Hmm.
This is about real people
Real people's lives.
being impacted.
Exactly.
And we haven't even touched on the potential legal challenges.
Oh, yeah.
Surely something this big would end up in court.
Oh, absolutely. You can bet there would be lawsuits from all sides.
Right.
States, advocacy groups, maybe even individual families.
Wow.
It could take years for everything to be sorted out.
Yeah.
And in the meantime,
Right.
a lot of uncertainty.
Uncertainty and probably a whole lot of political maneuvering.
Oh, for sure.
This whole thing feels like a Pandora's box
I know.
with all sorts of unintended consequences.
It's hard to predict exactly what those consequences would be.
Yeah.
But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
It would be a seismic shift in the landscape of American education.
Speaking of that landscape, one thing I've been thinking about is the role of private schools in all of this.
Well, interesting.
They don't usually receive federal funding, right?
That's generally true.
Okay.
There are a few exceptions, like for programs serving students with disabilities.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they operate independently of the Department of Education.
So would dismantling the department even affect them?
It's hard to say for certain.
Yeah.
They might see an influx of students
Oh, interesting.
if families become dissatisfied with changes in the public school system.
Okay.
Or maybe they'd face new challenges,
Right.
depending on how regulations and oversight shift.
It's just another layer of complexity
Right.
in an already tangled situation.
Exactly.
I'm starting to feel like we're barely scratching the surface here.
Well, that's the nature of a deep dive, isn't it?
Yeah.
The more you explore,
Right.
the more you realize how much more there is to uncover.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
Uh-huh.
It forces us to grapple with some really fundamental questions
Like what?
about the role of government,
Okay.
the purpose of education,
Right.
and, the kind of society we want to create.
Big picture stuff.
Big picture stuff.
But we're not done yet.
Not yet.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll leave you with some thought-provoking questions
Okay.
and some resources to continue exploring this topic.
Sounds good.
Stay with us.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're back. And I got to say, my head is spinning.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about what could happen, the history, this whole debate about the federal government being involved in education.
It's a lot.
It is.
A lot to think about.
So much. And we've just scratched the surface, really.
Yeah.
But before we go, I think we need to go back to that question.
Which one?
Like, what are the real arguments
Okay.
for and against
Right.
having a federal Department of Education?
The core of it all.
We've kind of danced around it,
We have.
but I don't think we've really answered it.
Fair enough.
Is it just about efficiency?
Well, that's certainly part of it.
Or is there something more to it?
People who want to get rid of the department,
Yeah.
they'll say it's bloated, too much bureaucracy,
Okay.
that the states can handle it better,
Uh-huh.
get the feds out of the picture, streamline things, save money, more control for local communities.
And that's a really appealing idea to a lot of people.
It is.
The idea that things should be handled closer to home.
Right. Less interference from Washington.
Right.
Definitely a popular idea.
But then there's the other side,
The flip side?
the argument for equity, for national standards.
Yeah.
Supporters of the department say that it's really important to make sure that all students,
Yeah.
no matter where they live,
Mm-hmm.
have access to a good education.
Exactly.
And they point to programs like Title,
Right.
that funding for low-income schools.
Right. You need that federal involvement.
Yeah, to level the playing fields.
Exactly.
They also say that the department helps set standards for the whole country,
National standard.
promotes innovation,
Yeah.
and protects civil rights and education.
Right. They worry without a federal watchdog,
Uh-huh.
you'll just see a bigger gap between states.
Right. Some kids getting left behind.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the money. It's about values.
It is.
What kind of education system do we want
Right.
for the whole country?
Big question.
Do we prioritize local control, even if that means some places do better than others?
More inequality.
Or do we go for those national standards,
Yeah.
even if that means more involvement from the federal government?
Those are the tough questions.
They really are.
And honestly, there are good points
Yeah.
on both sides.
I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
No easy answers. Not everyone's going to be happy.
It feels like this is about more than just the Department of Education.
It is.
Like, what is the role of government?
Yeah.
How should power be balanced? What does it even mean to be a nation?
Big questions.
Yeah.
LARP stuff.
It really is.
That's why this topic is so important.
Uh-huh.
Even if they're not like a teacher or a policy wonk.
Right. It affects everyone.
It does.
Parents, students, taxpayers.
All of us.
We all have a stake in this.
We do?
So what can we do
No.
if all of this...
If you're fired up,
Yeah.
you want to know more?
Where do we go from here?
First off, don't just take our word for it.
Right.
Do your own research.
Yeah.
Read articles from different sources, get perspectives from both sides.
Both sides of the argument.
There's tons of stuff out there.
Online.
Yeah, online, government websites, think tanks, advocacy groups, all that.
And talk to people.
Yeah.
Have those conversations.
Even if they disagree with you.
Yeah.
Engage respectfully, listen, try to understand where they're coming from.
You might learn something.
You might.
And this isn't a one-time thing.
No, it's ongoing.
Stay informed. Stay engaged.
Make your voice heard.
Write to your elected officials. Volunteer at your local school.
All of that.
Just talk to your friends and family about this stuff.
Every little bit counts.
It really does. Well, this has given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And I hope it's done the same for you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.